Trent Reznor as composer? Welcome back to The Curious Listener. Let me ask you something. When you were listening to records like The Downward Spiral back in 1994, if in fact you are ancient history like I am, did you do so thinking, yep, I totally can see this guy doing film scores for Disney movies someday? I mean, if you did, hand it to yourself. You're an absolute visionary, dude. That's impressive. I did not see the same dude who was doing songs like Closer or Hurt or albums with titles like Pretty Hate Machine becoming one of the most in-demand film composers in the world someday. And with Hollywood's award season having just concluded, it's time we took notice of what I consider to be one of the most fascinating narratives in music today, which is Trent Reznor. Trent Reznor, of course, of Nine Inch Nails fame. Nine Inch Nails having announced a world tour back in January. I think they've got 30 dates overall coming up, mostly stateside, but starting with a few dates in the UK and Europe. June 17th, he's got a date in the UK, and then a couple dates out there, and then a couple dates in Germany, before a tour of 26 cities in the United States. And now might be the moment in which to see Nine Inch Nails live. It's certainly, I think, as I hope I'm about to persuade you, one of the most fascinating moments ever to see Nine Inch Nails live. This is possibly the most fascinating moment in Trent Reznor's entire career. And I think 26 of those dates here in the U.S., so you're going to have plenty of chances to do so. Trent Reznor is 59 years old, if you can believe it. He is going to turn 60 on May 17th, just a couple months from now. Okay. Talk about feeling old. Woo! All right. I ain't kidding when I say at the top that if you were listening to Downward Spiral last century when it came out, you old, yo. All right. Listen, you see plenty of salt in this pepper, okay? Yeah, we're getting up there. We Nine Inch Nails fans from the beginning, all right? Listen, the questions that were paramount for me as I was watching this award season unfold this year, are things like, look at Trent Reznor winning that Golden Globe back in January. Did you see him win that Golden Globe back in January for his latest film score with Atticus Ross, his longtime collaborator, for a movie called Challengers? Did you know that Trent Reznor has won 3 Golden Globes over the past 15 years? That's how long this has been going on. Starting with the first score he ever did, he wins a Golden Globe for. So The Social Network in 2010. Soul, that's the Disney movie, the Pixar film, in 2020. A gorgeous, beautiful film with its homage to jazz. It's bringing existential questions surrounding mortality and death to a children's audience. I mean, there's a daringness there that you could see having enticed Trent Reznor into the project easily. And then Challengers in 2025, his 3rd Golden Globe Award. Did you know he's won 2 Academy Awards over that period of time? For The Social Network and for Soul in 2020, which he collaborated on, by the way, with the brilliant Jon Batiste, on the soundtrack. Did you know that Trent Reznor has been nominated for 7 Golden Globes now? 7. He's been nominated 3 times at the Oscars. And for my money, I have to say, this has become one of the most underrated stories in music. For Trent Reznor to be piling up Golden Globes and Oscars, it's something probably few Nine Inch Nails fans saw coming 30 years ago, that he would become an in-demand presence as a composer of film scores who gangs up awards like that as a matter of routine at this point is, to me, a revelation. He, by the way, has done many more film scores than Nine Inch Nails albums. Now, did you know that? Nine Inch Nails albums. He's got 11 Nine Inch Nails albums from 1989's Pretty Hate Machine to 2020's Ghost 6 Locusts, okay? But 18 film scores or soundtracks combined. That includes his score for, as I said, the Disney Pixar film Soul. He's produced many more film scores and soundtracks than Nine Inch Nails albums at this point. And there's a good reason for that, as I'm about to get into. I think it shows you something about where Trent Reznor is as an artist at age 59. Okay. Now I mentioned Atticus Ross. This is a guy he's been collaborating with since 2002. Officially became, as I understand it, a member of Nine Inch Nails in 2016. But he's been working with Atticus Ross on all these film scores. Okay. And some of the work that these two have done together has yielded some achingly beautiful music on these scores. I mean, to the point that this stuff really ought to be considered as worthy of regard as any records that Trent has done under the Nine Inch Nails umbrella. Okay, just listen, for example, to a song called "To the Wild Sky" on a soundtrack to a 2022 film called Empire of Light. It is this utterly breathtaking, icily gorgeous melody that has these whispering harmonies to it in this instrumental. You could put this stuff up against any score that's been done over the past 15 years by anyone, and I think it'll hold its own. Again, I ask you, who saw this coming? Who saw this kind of tender, beautifully harmonic melody making coming at such a consistent clip from a guy who stakes his claim in music 30 years ago, 35 years ago, not by recording this kind of stuff, but rather by recording booming, pulverizing industrial rock and dragging that stuff into the mainstream, as he did triumphantly back in the early to mid-90s. You know, you had the Downward Spiral in 94. You had the Fragile in 1999, his double disc magnum opus. Brilliant work at that time. And now we're seeing this surprising new dimension come to life in Trent Reznor's accomplishment in music here in the realm of film. That's giving him access to these new creative vistas he might never have tapped into had it not been for David Fincher, the director of The Social Network in 2010, and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo the following year, for which he also, Trent and Atticus, both did the score. Had it not been for that invitation out of the blue from David Fincher, who trusted Trent Reznor to do something he literally had never done before, to the point that Reznor, as he's talking about this now, in this brilliant GQ interview that I will link to in the description. You've got to see it if you care at all about Trent Reznor, Nine Inch Nails, or what he's done with Atticus Ross on these film scores. And he says, I had no idea what I was doing. I had to learn a new medium from scratch. Okay? And that, by the way, importantly, and this is what makes this story, to me, as a longtime Johnny Cash fan, so moving. Because that's exactly what the story was for Johnny Cash, who was given these songs by Rick Rubin, right? Not just Trent Reznor's Nine Inch Nails song Hurt, but heavy metal band Danzig's song 13. Johnny Cash covers that song in a solo acoustic version on his eponymous debut for American Recordings in 1994. Next record, he does a grunge band's Soundgarden's Rusty Cage, a grunge band song. Electrified, brilliantly done, with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers backing him up. Mike Campbell kicking that song in the ass behind Johnny, and Johnny's booming larger-than-life voice. It's freaking brilliant. And as I said, as we all remember, and as I'll talk about in greater depth here, Nine Inch Nails' Hurt song, right? Johnny Cash was bewildered to be told to tiptoe in the direction of these genres by Rick Rubin. But Rick Rubin, as always, being the visionary genius that he long has been, he trusted Rick enough to go with it. And in each of those cases, the results were the definition of creative brilliance and artistic courage. And I think that's what we're seeing here from Trent Reznor. You know, Johnny Cash was down and out at the point that Rick Rubin gave him this chance at a last burst of creative life. Johnny Cash had been dumped by Columbia Records in the late 1980s. He recorded a record of overly familiar Cash songs for Mercury after that. I forget the name of that record now, but it's got this great song in there called Going by the Book. The Mystery of Life is the name of that record. I love that record, but the problem was it was populated almost entirely by songs that people had heard too many times before, so that was no way at resuscitating the career of this down-and-out country legend, right? Well, Rick Rubin puts Johnny in a room with nothing but a stool, a microphone, and an acoustic guitar and says, "Go at it, Johnny. Go ahead." Scared the crap out of him. This is a very vulnerable scenario that Rick Rubin had invited him to participate in, okay? But this again, as we're seeing with Trent Reznor, getting that call from David Fincher out of the blue, hey, can you score a film? What? I've never done that. Well, why are you asking me to do this? Well, Johnny Cash, same thing, right? These are artists who, pushed themselves, allowed themselves to be dragged out of creative comfort zones in which perhaps they had confined themselves maybe for too long, and into creative spaces in which they felt like imposters, like strangers. This courage rewarded them with some of the most powerful and moving and memorable music of their lives. And in Trent's case, it's not just that the music is great or that they're practicing this artistic courage. They're just having fun, dude. I mean, when you watch that GQ interview, as I hope you'll do, grab that link in the description of this video. They start talking about playing around with Edvard Grieg's classical masterpiece, Hall of the Mountain King, in the first score they ever did, The Social Network, first score they ever did, winning both a Golden Globe and an Oscar. Such was David Fincher's visionary genius for seeing that potential in Trent, a guy who to that point had never done any such thing in his career. Now, you know this melody, Hall of the Mountain King, by heart, even if you don't think you do. Cue it up on I'll link to it in the description. Grab it there. And you'll say, oh, yeah, that. Okay, that'll be your reaction, all right? But David Fincher told him, I want it to sound like Wendy Carlos. Wendy Carlos, who scored Clockwork Orange. Wendy Carlos, who put out Bach-inspired synthesizer records that were pioneering in impact, like the Well-Tempered synthesizer in 1969, switched on Bach in 1968. And Atticus says on this whole Edvard Grieg thing that they toyed around with for The Social Network in 2010, quote, the thing about Hall of the Mountain King is that if you listen to the traditional version, you've got a choir, and it's speeding up. Ours needed to carry all that same weight, but using electronic instruments. At one point, after they do this score for The Social Network, David Fincher's very next project, after all the success of The Social Network with Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross doing the score, calls him in again to do Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And at one point on that score, they have the brilliant insight to sort of latch onto the sound of a floor cleaner, yes, a floor cleaner, in a particularly harrowing scene in Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. They ask the film team for that sound file. They tune that sound of a floor cleaner to a D chord and make it the lead instrument in a piece of music they come up with to score this particularly disturbing scene in a Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. This is the fun they're having. Edvard Grieg filtered through the lens of Wendy Carlos. Give me the sound file for that floor cleaner. Let's tune that floor cleaner to a D chord, an appliance as the lead instrument in this piece of music. Also with the Girl from the Dragon Tattoo, and again, they talk about all this in this great GQ interview. Great job, folks at GQ. It's a really insightful look into their creative process, okay? David Fincher apparently, per Trent Reznor in that interview, quote, wanted Sweden and the cold to be a character in the film. And we felt we should explore what sounds cold. A lot of digital synthesizers and digital ways of presenting sounds tends to feel icier and less comfortable. This is delicious stuff. The extent to which the challenge that scoring a film presents Trent Reznor is compelling him to expand his creative horizons in these ways that he perhaps never would have previously, is again a wonderful revelation for even the most casual fan of Nine Inch Nails. These scores deserve regard as records that stand on their own within the Nine Inch Nails canon, okay? I queue up the Challengers soundtrack for reasons I'll get into when I'm working out. That's what I'm listening to sometimes on Spotify as I'm benching and squatting and all the rest at the gym. And I have not seen the film. This music is so good to my ear that it stands apart from the film for which it was made. So I really think that at this point, 18 scores into this project now, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, it's time to start thinking about these scores as records in and of themselves that that have in them. There are some rockers on these. The Social Network has a rockin' tune on it that I forget the name of it as I'm speaking, but it I think stands alongside most of the best work on any Nine Inch Nails record. There's a song towards the end of this Challenger soundtrack. It's a vocal, mostly instrumental stuff, but then there's a song called Compress Repress toward the end of that album. I guarantee you that is one of the greatest Trent Reznor songs that he's done in recent memory, and absolutely without doubt would hold its own on any Nine Inch Nails record. Okay? So to think to yourself, well, these are film scores. I'm not going to, that's not it's nice, but I'm not going to, like, it's not an album for me to listen to. Think again, you're cheating yourself. Again, if you're even the most casual of Nine Inch Nails fans, check out, I'll link to Compress Repress also in the description here. Listen to it. It's great. Nine Inch Nails glory. I'm telling you. This stuff, we must not ignore this stuff as if you're a fan of Trent Reznor, if you're a fan of Nine Inch Nails. Don't cheat yourself. Check this stuff out, man. Their embrace, again, of the challenges of film scoring show you, that each score they've done together presents its own set of unique challenges and individual creative possibilities that they have to navigate with the same degree of courage and spirit of exploration that guys like Johnny Cash practiced by taking a chance on songs like Hurt, okay? That were way out of left field for anything Johnny had done to that point. Now, challengers, talk about the individual challenges that each score presents. Well, let's talk about the most recent one that was celebrated at the Golden Globes. The director of challengers wanted it to be called Dance Music All the Way Through. Dance music all the way through. So music that was more club than rock, all right? They needed to bring that sort of club beat vibe into this score. It disproportionately favors dance and groove, club beat type sounds over the kind of industrial rock that Trent Reznor is known for. But you hear him and Atticus luxuriating and delighting in that challenge on this soundtrack. This is why I'm queuing it up at the gym here and there, man. Trent, he says in this GQ interview that he's enjoying this so much that he and Atticus don't just sit around waiting for film projects to come to them. They're sending out feelers now. They're like, hey, this, that, the other, they hear a director working on a particular project, they get wind of a script, whatever it is. And they're initiating some of these dialogues that yield the projects they become a part of. And I think they're doing that because this work has re-energized Trent Reznor in a way that has deepened his aesthetic beyond anything I think we had any right to think possible back in the Downward Spiral, Pretty Hate Machine, and Fragile days. This work is a creative renaissance for an artist whose legacy already was sizable enough without this creative second wind that his career for the last 15 years now as a film scorer has created for him. This is, I think, what we're hearing is a relentlessly creative artist who's seeking to expand his creative horizons and doing so by being surprisingly dragged into this film score realm out of the blue. Thanks to David Fincher. Thank you, David, for doing this. Taking a chance on Trent 15 years ago because, man, so much interesting music has emerged from this ever since. I think this is one of the most important stories in music of the 21st century. I think this is one of the most surprising developments in pop music in the last 15 years, what Trent Reznor is up to here. And the allusion to Johnny Cash, to me, makes clear that not only is this one of the most important stories in music of the 21st century, in my view, but it's a story that has a certain poetic arc to it. Because remember, back in 2002, when Johnny Cash, he stopped the music world in its tracks with his solo acoustic cover of Hurt by Trent Reznor from the last song, right? The coda on Downward Spiral in 1994. It gets accentuated or punctuated by this brilliant music video by famed music director Mark Romanek, whose video for that song has been hailed as, quote, by many critics and fans alike, as the most personal and moving music video ever made. Yes, I will link to that too in the description. If you haven't seen that, you must. Okay. He was nominated, Mark Romanek, for 7 Video Music Awards and also won a Grammy for that video. Just as maybe few people saw Trent Reznor's rise as an in-demand film composer coming, not many people saw Johnny Cash blowing the music world away with a Nine Inch Nails cover. Okay, again, this guy who had been doing this for almost a decade by then with the Danzig and Soundgarden covers. What was Johnny Cash doing with those projects? He was expanding his own creative horizons at the very end of his life throughout his 60s. What is Trent Reznor doing as a film composer here in the last 15 years? Here at age 59, set to turn 60 in a couple months, exactly the same thing, man. Exactly the same thing Johnny did. So in a way, 23 years ago, when Johnny blew Trent away, and we're about to hear Trent's perspective on that Johnny Cash cover, by the way, because he talks about it in the GQ interview, from which I'll quote in a second. Johnny was foreshadowing this second chapter in Trent Reznor's creative experience. Johnny was foreshadowing the extent to which Trent Reznor's own work made itself available to genres he didn't envision as being accessible to the work he was doing. And here comes David Fincher seeing Trent Reznor as visionary enough as an artist to himself be a mind that could perhaps be available to a genre in which Reznor had never even tiptoed before. So I think this is the extent to which there's a certain poetic arc to what Trent Reznor is accomplishing here, okay? Reznor says this about the Johnny Cash cover in this GQ interview. Quote, Rick Rubin, who is a friend, called and said, "Would you mind if we tried this song?" Meaning Hurt. "No, of course not," Reznor said. "It seemed weird. I assumed they're probably doing 100 songs. Then I get the recording of it a little bit later, and that felt weird because that's my song. That big voice in there, it felt weird at the moment. I remember I was in the middle of The Fragile when I heard it. I'm not ready to process this right now," he thought. "And then I got the Mark Romanek video. And that was like, quote, Jesus Christ. The thought of, here's a thing that I wrote from a very intimate place, and it's connected now with someone else, this larger-than-life personality in Johnny Cash. And then, oddly, it becomes a kind of epitaph for his life, and it happened to be filmed by one of the greatest directors ever and presented in such a beautiful way, it reminds you of the power of music and how important it is." Amen, Trent. Amen. And indeed, it did become Johnny Cash's epitaph. Johnny released that cover in November of 2002. He was dead by September of 2003, 10 months later at the age of 71. And when you watch the video, you understand exactly what Trent means when he says that song became Johnny Cash's epitaph. Visually, that is precisely the message that music video advances. Thanks to Mark Romanek's brilliant and tender compassion and vision that he brought to Johnny Cash's life and the arc of Johnny Cash's life. So this is a moment in which, with these film scores, celebrated as they are, all of these Golden Globes, all of these Oscars, the poetic art to this story, accentuated by Johnny Cash's intervention in Trent Reznor's career in this beautiful way, his legacy now, he's got this world tour coming up with Nine Inch Nails, is showing itself to be rather substantial here in 2025. As I'm speaking to you, right, Lady Gaga just put out this new record called Mayhem. Yes? Okay, have you heard it? There's some interesting stuff on there. It gets off to a particularly booming start. I like it. I feel like it becomes a bit more pedestrian as it carries on, although towards the end there's a resurgence of some interesting tracks, like songs like Killa, for instance, okay? But this record by Lady Gaga serves up huge doses of homage to Trent Reznor, to Nine Inch Nails. I just listened to this snippet from AllMusic's favorable review of that album. Quote, Gaga had mentioned that one of the album's influences was industrial music and, in particular, Nine Inch Nails. That inspiration is heard on the first half, starting with the pulsing rocker Disease, which is great. On Garden of Eden, another track on the record, quote, as if her line about 9-inch heels did not make her point, the digital squall in the outro cements the Nine Inch Nails influence, carrying into the dark, another song, Perfect Celebrity, one of the album's many musings on Gaga's personal struggles. Killa, meanwhile, struts like St. Vincent or Trent Reznor, taking their own crack at Bowie and Prince. Well played by the reviewer of that record, since Trent Reznor produced David Bowie's 1997 album Earthling, which, if you haven't heard and you're a Trent Reznor fan to any degree, take a shot at that one. I'm Afraid of Americans is on there. 7 Years in Tibet is on there. Really, some of David Bowie's, the best work of the latter half of his career is on that record, uneven though it may be. Okay. Now, Trent, it's not just that Lady Gaga is paying her homage to Trent, but he was asked at the Golden Globes this year in 2025 what he thought was the best song of 2024. And of all selections, he says Sabrina Carpenter's Espresso. That's Trent Reznor, industrial rock god. That's his call for best song of 2024. How fascinating is that? It's very telling within the context of this Challenger's score that Trent Reznor just won the Golden Globe for. Okay? Espresso, Sabrina Carpenter's Espresso. This is a track on which she collaborates with Jack Antonoff. Of course, he's done a lot of celebrated work with Lana Del Rey and Taylor Swift, but you hear a freshness to Antonoff's work on that particular track that I think had been waning in Antonoff's work, especially on Taylor Swift's more recent output. Tortured Poets Department, for me, was a boring disappointment in the aftermath of the brilliant Midnights, and to me had no business being nominated for Album of the Year at the Grammys. Okay, but on that track, there's something about what Sabrina Carpenter brings to the table, her snarky, sassy lyrics, the glowing self-confidence she brings to her whole image, and certainly her songwriting. There's some delicious beats on that record throughout. I think it's Sabrina Carpenter's album. There's an album that was worthy of Album of the Year consideration, okay? And was every bit deserving of every Grammy that it won last month in February. But you hear on that collaboration, throughout that record, there's, as is the case with what's that new song by Pig Pony Club and a Hot to Go, Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess. Why is her name escaping me? But she's got this new single called Good Luck Babe, which is overtly a nod to 80s jams and vibes. And you hear maybe a bit less overtly here on Sabrina Carpenter's record, still some sort of nostalgic tributes to 80s club beats and drum machines and synthesizers that Antonoff is injecting into the music of Sabrina. That stuff is clearly of great appeal to older artists like Trent Reznor, who also deploys these same kind of 80s drum machine type approaches to his work on this Challenger score. Gloss with some surprising flourishes of synthesizers. There are moments when, as I said, Reznor even busts out with some vocal performances on the brilliant compressed Repress that absolutely would sound perfectly at home on any Nine Inch Nails record. You've got to hear that, man. But on many of the instrumentals on Challengers, it makes more and more sense why Trent Reznor would be gravitating toward music like Sabrina Carpenter's Espresso now. Because on those instrumentals, a given track it'll be locked into a certain melody, but then from there, Atticus and Trent expanded out with some surprising flourishes of synth, or what might sound like string arrangements that are sort of accented with Middle Eastern tinged sounds that are probably the work of synthesizers or keyboards. They're pulling on a variety of influences here, and often bringing together a surprising stew of sounds and influences that they blend together often enough in surprising ways. Again, I think this stuff stands apart within the Nine Inch Nails canon, not just as film scores. And in retrospect, man, I think years from now, we're going to be reappraising the work that Trent has done with Atticus on these film scores. And I think we might come to regard his work in film as equally worthy of regard as any Nine Inch Nails album you want to name. I'll link to this stuff in the description. Definitely check it out. Compress Repress in particular, if you haven't heard from the Challenger soundtrack or Challenger score, check that out. And if you've made it this far in this video, consider tapping subscribe. I love talking music with you, and I'd love to talk more music with you next time.